Okay. Okay, thank you. Welcome to the second paper of the day. The paper is by John Webber from Cardiff. He tells me that the paper is relatively short, so we may be able to finish on time at 11:30. John's areas of expertise are existentialism and ethics. He published Existentialism and Jean-Paul Sartre in 2008, together with a book, an edited collection on reading Sartre. And he's talking today about dispositions and reflective deliberation.
Thank you, and thanks to Javi and Darian for inviting me. So, what I'm going to talk about today is a dilemma which I think can be constructed out of a cluster of problems that people see with virtue ethics. And I want to explain the dilemma as I set it up, and then go on to resolve it. The term virtue ethics is used in a variety of different ways. What I'm interested in is the view that the primary goal of one's ethical practice ought to be to cultivate the virtues. So what you should be aiming at doing as a moral agent or an ethical agent is forming the right kind of character traits. Now, that can inform public policy, right? It can inform education policy, it can inform penal policy, if you see rehabilitation as part of penal practice. But I'm particularly interested in the first personal version of the claim. So the claim that as a moral agent, what I ought to be doing is perfecting my own character. And as I say, a number of philosophers see various problems around this idea. Stuart Hampshire wrote about this. Bernard Williams talks about it in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Alan Thomas writes about it quite recently, and various other people have written about it. Who else have I got down there? Richard Moran as well. So here's the dilemma. I mean, this is my way of setting it up, but I think it encompasses the problems that these people worry about. Right? If your aim is to cultivate your own character, then there's a question to be asked about why you're doing it. On the one hand, you might be cultivating your own character because you see your own self-perfection as an end in itself, right? As the moral goal, the ethical goal. And that can look rather narcissistic. So here's Narcissus. Because it looks like you think that the sole goal of your ethical reflection and practice is making yourself into a certain kind of person. On the other hand, you might think that the goal is to make yourself a certain kind of person because that way you will do the right thing in the right situations, right? So the real goal is right action or good action, whatever, but that the right means to that is for you to focus on cultivating virtues. And that, I want to suggest, involves a certain kind of doublethink about yourself. So I'm going to say a lot more about these things. But just briefly, this isn't a dilemma about what ultimately justifies the cultivation of virtue, right? It's a dilemma concerning what you, as a moral agent, ought to think of yourself as doing. And there's a difference. The reason there's a difference is that a moral theory can be, as Harford pointed out, self-effacing. That is, one might be, or the correct moral theory might turn out to be, a form of utilitarianism that says that what matters is promoting happiness or welfare or whatever, but that as a moral agent, one really ought not to think of oneself as a utilitarian, ought not to aim at that, but instead ought to aim at cultivating the virtues for their own sake. In that case, although in terms of justification, the thought isn't that virtue is an end in itself, nevertheless, as a moral agent, it's what you should be aiming at, so it'll still be over in this category. So this is the dilemma. Okay. Well, I should have asked, has everybody got a handout? Does the handout come round? Well, some people got the handout and not others. Could you?
Is there anyone that doesn't have a handout? It's not it.
Yeah, I've put them all down here. Okay, well, that was section 1 on the handout, which is setting up the dilemma. So, the next couple of sections, I'm going to talk about each of the forms of the dilemma. Right. So, what is the charge of narcissism that I want to talk about? Well, look, the problem isn't a problem at the level of just unreflective action, right, straight ahead engagement in the world. Right? Why? Well, it's often pointed out that, except perhaps with some virtues, but generally the virtuous person doesn't necessarily act under the description of the virtues, as it were. They don't find themselves in a situation and think, now what would be the modest thing to do, and then I'll behave that way because that's will make me a modest person, or what would be the courageous thing to do, or what would be the honest thing to do. Instead, they respond to the demands of the situation as those are presented to them. And that possessing the virtues is a matter of seeing the situation in the right way. So it's not, this charge of narcissism is not the claim that if one is aiming at the virtues, then one's first order moral engagement in the world is always self-referential and narcissistic in that way. It's rather the thought that the goal of cultivating the virtues doesn't just involve first order ethical engagement in the world, it also involves a kind of second order ethical engagement, that is a reflection on one's own practice, right, a kind of self-critique, without which you can't really be said to be aiming at cultivating your character at all. And it's there, at that level, I think, that the charge of narcissism arises. I want to say a bit more about that, because what I mean by ethical reflection here isn't what Bernard Williams means by it in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Right? So what he's talking about is a philosophical reflection, if you like, on normative ethical theories, right? Thinking about what is the right way to live. And he thinks that that can unsettle one's commitment to a particular set of values. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a kind of reflection that occurs, as it were, within one's ethical standpoint, within one's commitment to a set of ethical values, but is a kind of critical reflection on oneself concerning the degree to which one is succeeding or failing in living up to those values. So it's that critical self-reflection that's involved, I think, in cultivating virtue, and it's that which can look narcissistic if one's goal is just, ethical goal is just cultivating virtue for its own sake, right? If one thinks that what one should be trying to do is perfect oneself. So the thought is, it's narcissistic if critical self-reflection on your ethical practice is just aimed at self-perfection. Okay. So that's one side of the dilemma. What's the other side? What's the charge of doublethink? Well, this is when an agent is attempting to form the correct character traits of themselves because they think that that way they will behave the right way in relevant situations. Okay? And this just invites the question, you know, why are you taking the scenic route? Right? Why not just try to behave correctly in the relevant situations? It seems to involve a commitment, or it might involve a commitment to the thought that how one behaves in any given situation just kind of flows mechanically from one's character and isn't a matter of deliberation and decision. Right? But if that's So there's your character that you're trying to form, right? Here's you, and you're seeing that as a kind of thing that just reacts to situations. But if that's right, it must be true of you too, right? And your own deliberation and decision and about forming your character seems to suggest that your character isn't something that simply responds mechanically in situations, right? It seems that rather that deliberation and decision is what controls your behaviour, otherwise you couldn't be forming a character this way. In which case, why form a character? Why not just try to do the right thing? Now you might think, well, what that overlooks is something which virtue theorists are often very keen on, which is the thought that patterns of behaviour, kinds of responses can become habituated. This is often equated with being habits or habitual. It's not really quite the same thing. If anything, I think the recent psychological literature on automaticity is closer to what virtue ethicists have often seemed to be interested in. Right? That is that often you find yourself in a situation where you just have to react. Like Aristotle's example is on the battlefield. Right? The virtuous fighter on the battlefield is responding very quickly to the situation as it changes. They're not stopping and deliberating and thinking and making decisions, but nevertheless their behaviour is intelligent and it's manifesting virtues. So you might think, well, that's what justifies this. It isn't doublethink. It's really just a question about the difference between the kind of level of deliberation and decision and then the more kind of automatised, habituated behaviour that's involved in everyday life. But even that, I think, doesn't really get you out of the charge of doublethink, because the literature on automaticity, I think even sort of common sense reflection on automaticity suggests that, as indeed Aristotle suggests, that the way to kind of program, as it were, your automatic responses in the right way is just to do the right thing. It's just to behave in the right ways. It's just to get on and try and make the right decisions in the right situations, and these will become sedimented. So again, it looks like aiming to form one's character as a means to doing the right thing is not just a kind of scenic route. That's not just the problem. The problem is that it seems to involve thinking about oneself in these two different ways, which aren't wholly consistent. Now, as I said, this dilemma, as I've set it up, encompasses, I hope, the concerns and discussions of a number of people in the literature. It's not often set up this way, particularly the thought of doublethink. It's usually more likely to be set up in a discussion of the difference between making predictions and making decisions, right? So the thought is that if I know you well enough and I know your character well enough, then I can predict how you're going to behave in some given situation. But I can't treat myself as a subject of prediction in the same way. Why? Because I have to make decisions. My action is governed by my decisions. So even if I predict how I'm going to behave, that still leaves it open how I'm going to behave, right? Because I have a more direct control. And so there's quite a lot of literature on the difference between predictions and decisions. Now I think some of this literature is kind of, in a way, the water's slightly muddy by this talk of prediction, because often people are talking about intentions for future action, and then other times they're talking about intentions for sort of immediate action or just immediate action, and I think the thing gets a bit confused, so I don't think that's the best way of putting it. But I also think that the literature on this is quite messy. So sometimes it's said that one shouldn't take one's own character as an object of knowledge for oneself, or that one can't. Sometimes it's said that one can't, and then it sort of slips, as you read through the paper, into being a kind of ethical injunction that one ought not. But this just seems false, right? I mean, it seems pretty obvious that if you know that you are chronically acratic, or weak-willed, then sure, you can kind of resolve, make a decision that you're going to stop being weak-willed, but it would be crazy to think that having made that decision, that's all there was to it. I mean, obviously, you've got to take into account the fact that you classically don't stick to these decisions. So maybe then you need to think about how to overcome aprasia or whatever. So seeing your character as an object in that way does seem to be important. So understanding, or making sort of correct or probable predictions about how one's likely to behave despite one's decisions is important. And it also invites the question, well, look, if you knew your character really, really well, if you knew it well enough, why wouldn't you be able to predict how you would behave? I'll put that another way. Why wouldn't you be able to predict what decision you would make? And this is where the literature tends to get a bit murky. So the objection to treating one's own character as an object in a way required for cultivating virtue, it's sometimes said that what's lacking, if you know your character really, really well and so can predict the decision that you're going to make, what's lacking there is something else that's involved in decision, right? A rational underwriting of the reasons on which you base your decision, or a rational commitment to continue to underwrite the value that those reasons have for you. That's terminology taken from Alan Thomas. And the word commitment occurs a lot in this literature. Something about this kind of commitment or rational underwriting is supposed to show that although you can make predictions in the case of other people, you can't treat yourself as an object of prediction in the same way. And I find this rather mysterious. For one thing, I find it rather mysterious that one's predictions of other people seem to work, even though they have to, or in principle could work, even though they have to rationally underwrite or commit to their values. But more to the point, I think that it's hard to see what this rational commitment is if it isn't a response to the reasons you find yourself faced with in the situation where you have to make a decision. So here's the thought: if you know your character well enough, you know how the situation will strike you. You know what reasons will present themselves to you. In which case, you ought to be able to know what decision you made. Then comes the objection: no, there's this other level of kind of rational commitment or underwriting of those reasons. But it's hard to see how that could even be rational if it isn't just a response to the reasons, other reasons that one has. So I think my worry here is a kind of version of the Humean objection to indeterminism in a way. It just looks like all it does is either this talk doesn't really amount to anything, or it introduces a little gap of randomness, right, in the action. And I don't think we want to do either of those things. So I want to go another way, and I think setting thing up as the charge of double thing sort of helps with this. I want to suggest that the reason why you can't treat yourself as a subject of prediction, or at least if you do, you're likely to go wrong a lot. A classic example of this is Stanley Milgram's experiments with electric shocks, or fake electric shocks. When that experiment's described to people, the vast majority of people think that they themselves would not press the button, would not do what they're told. But of course, we find that when you actually run the experiment, the majority of people do what they're told. Right? So people just fail to predict how they're going to respond in that situation. Why do they fail? Well, I think we should just take seriously the thought that you don't know your own character very well, right? Or you don't know it well enough. And that just explains the predictive failure, without this talk of this slightly mysterious, I think, talk of this other element of rational commitment. So you fail to predict correctly how you're going to behave when you're just mistaken about how the situation is going to seem to you. In the Milgram case, the mistake, I think, is partly this, that when the situation is described to you, you focus on the victim, the learner, the person to whom you'll be issuing the electric shocks. And the stern man in the white coat holding the clipboard telling you to do it is kind of in the background. It's not really the focus of your attention. But when you're in the situation, your attention is focused the other way, And as a result, the kind of force that that the experimenter has over you in the situation is something that wasn't apparent to you when you were making the prediction. So it's not obvious to you. And I think this is what people say too when they come out of the Milgram experiment. You know, they were surprised by how much it just seemed to them that they should do what this guy said. So the thought is this, and I think this is what Williams is getting at towards the end of Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, when he says that, you know, when he's talking about the morality system, and he says that morality seems to require a level of responsibility that cuts through character, that you're responsible for your action independently of how your character is, and he says that that's just an illusion. So I think the thought is, that were you to have perfect knowledge of your own character, then you could predict your behaviour. You could predict the decisions that you would make, and thus your behaviour. Now these thoughts, I think, this moves on to section 5, these thoughts suggest a way of resolving the dilemma. Is the next picture. If your character traits are best revealed to you, as it were, in the mirror of the world, in the way the world strikes you, in the reasons that it presents to you, if the Milgram experiment surprises the subjects because it shows them that they're more obedient, or perhaps more deferential than they thought they were, right? This suggests that the best guide to your own character traits, to your own personal dispositions, is actually the way situations seem to you, the way the world figures in your experience. In which case, critical reflection on your own character traits, the kind of critical reflection that's required for cultivating virtues, should focus there. Right? It should focus not on your own patterns of behaviour in the past, not on how you would like to think of yourself, right? But on the way in which situations seem to you, on the way in which they strike you, in the way in which Milgram subjects say, I was surprised by how much it seemed to me that I should do what he said. So second order deliberation about one's character traits involved in ethical practice aimed at cultivating virtues should take as its object first order deliberation. The reasons one considers, the degree, the weights one ascribes to those reasons, the things that one overlooks, has overlooked, and so on. And there's a reason why I think philosophers working in this area have overlooked this option. Right? And it's derived from, I think, from a reading of Sartre. I mean, it certainly explicitly is in some cases, in the case of Moran and Thomas, and it does seem to be bubbling around, perhaps, in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy too. Williams contrasts these two things, which he calls the inside point of view on your action and the outside point of view on your action. And the inside point of view, what it's like for you as an agent, what it is for you as an agent, is what I've been calling first order deliberation. It's being confronted with situations, weighing up the various considerations, making decisions and acting. And then the outside point of view is an external point of view on yourself, which is in principle accessible to other people too. Right? So you're seeing yourself from the outside as another person. And so what information do you have then, where you have sort of information about the patterns of your past behaviour? Now you've got more information about that than other people have got about you, because you follow yourself around all the time. But in principle the same information is available to other people too. And the reason why these two things are contrasted, that seems to cut out this kind of third perspective, which is, as it were, a kind of inside point of view, because it's only available to you. But nevertheless, it's not first order deliberation. It's a kind of reflection on how situations figure with you, how which reasons are presented to you and with what degree of force. I think the reason why this third option is overlooked is that people take seriously Sartre's view that experience of the world is, as it were, just an openness to the world. Right? What you find in experience of the world, in your experience of the world, is just the world. So the thought is that if you then reflect on that experience, what you'll find is just the world. You won't find anything else. You won't find anything new that wasn't already there. Now I think this is a mistake. The first bit, obviously I want to agree with. I think people have been trying to move away from the idea that experience is an inner world that you can reflect on, but is instead just a way in which the real world is presented to you. As John Searle says somewhere, that there's no such thing as introspection because there is no intro to spect. But it doesn't follow from that reflection on your experience can't teach you anything about your experience. At least phenomenologists should hope not. Because what's missing, in a way, from that kind of simpler reading of Sartre's distinction between being for itself and the way experience occurs, and on the other hand, one's being for others, is that in the former case, right, although experience just presents the world, it does present the world as it is shaped by one's projects, in Sartre's terminology, by one's concerns, one's values, and so on. So the world presents is a rich world of invitations and demands and prescriptions and so on, right, reasons to act in one way or another. And so in reflecting on experience, in principle, in reflecting on how the sunflowers appear to Van Gogh, rather than just looking at sunflowers, you see your reasons and your deliberation in a different light, in a different perspective. Okay, so how does this resolve the dilemma? Well, essentially, what I want to say is, if you see the goal of ethical practice, the cultivation of virtues that way, then neither the charge of narcissism nor the charge of doublethink sticks. Okay, so here's how it reflects on the narcissism. I think the charge of narcissism, there's some discussion about exactly what this charge is, right? Williams seems to suggest early in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy that the charge is essentially that in thinking about your own character, what you're thinking about is how you appear to others. Because that's what the character kind of is. Now, I don't think that's essential to this charge. You might be right, but the fact that it's how one appears to others, I don't think is essential to the worry. Narcissus, we'll see, is more concerned with how he appears to himself than how he appears to others, perhaps. Now, I think the charge really just is that it's you at the centre of your ethical reflection. Really, that looks a little self-involved. You might think ethics is a bit more about other people and the world at large, and perhaps somebody who is just concerned with their own cultivation really needs to get out of themselves a bit. Or as Williams puts it, there is something of priggishness about this. But the way I've set it up, that's not what they're doing. This is not what one is doing in second order deliberation, of the sort that I'm talking about, in reflection on one's own character, because access to one's character isn't by introspection, it isn't by gazing at your image in the mirror or in the history of your action or anything of the sort. It's about reflecting on how situations strike you, what reasons they present, and how those reasons weigh with you. Ethical practice on this view itself involves a kind of phenomenology. Right? It involves a kind of thinking about the way in which situations strike you. What about doublethink? This is a bit more complicated. The original charge of doublethink was that it looks as though you're being, this is where you are aiming to cultivate your character in order to ensure that you engage in right action, or in order to improve the quality of your action. And it looks like that involves, on the one hand, thinking of one's character as something that simply determines one's behaviour, and on the other hand, not thinking of it that way, thinking of one's behaviour instead as flowing from decisions and deliberation, because that's what you're doing when you're trying to form your character. This, again, when people discuss this, the discussion is often informed by Sartre, right? They think of Sartre's discussion of bad faith here, that there's a certain kind of bad faith involved in this, because you're seeing your character as though it's a fixed entity that just determines your action, even though, in the very practice of doing that, you're contradicting it. Now, as I've set up this kind of ethical reflection, and that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is assessing and deliberating about and making decisions about how you deliberate and make decisions. So the object of your deliberation, as it were, you as an agent in first order moral action, operates the same way as you as an agent in second order deliberation is operating. So you don't have that charge of doublethink. But the worry is, I guess, that there's another version of the charge. And this is something that I think worries Williams to some extent in Ethics and the Limits, but I'm not sure I understand exactly how it fits in there. Because after all, what I've said about all this is that you confront situations and they present reasons to you that themselves reflect your character traits, right? So presumably, that's going to be true in second order deliberation too, right? Unless you think that somehow there's something important about reflection on your own character which kind of frees you from the lens of your own values, projects, or whatever, then it looks like you're kind of stymied in your attempts, or it might look like you're stymied in your attempts to reflect critically on how things strike you in ordinary unreflective behaviour, because how that strikes you is going to be filtered by exactly the same values and commitments and so on as it itself is filtered by. I don't think this is a problem in the end. So one views, as I think Williams puts it, you view your character from within that character. But I will say a little bit about why I don't think that's problematic. It would be problematic if it undermined the critical role of second order deliberation, if it meant that there was essentially no critical distance between you as you reflect on the way situations strike you, and on the other hand, the thing that you're reflecting on. But I think there is a critical distance there. So in first order deliberation, in action, what you're focused on is the situation itself. And it makes demands and presents reasons which have a certain kind of urgency to which you must respond. The thought is that in reflection on that, you're kind of detached from that urgency. You reflect on it, I think Butler's phrase, originally, in a cool hour. And that allows you, I think, perhaps, to take a kind of a critical eye to the ways in which these reasons are related to one another. Secondly, there's a difference, very obviously, between the values that you would avow, the values to which you, in some sense, are committed, or perhaps put better, the values to which you'd like to be more committed, and the values which are in fact manifested sometimes in your behaviour. Again, the Milgram experiment is a good example. And these people didn't want to think that obedience to the instructions was more important than the suffering and perhaps death of this other person. But on the other hand, their actions seemed to display a commitment to that value structure. And that's what surprises them and disheartens them. So again, I mean, you can take a kind of critical distance from the values to which you seem to be committed by contrasting them with the values to which you would like to be more committed, the ones which you would avow linguistically. And finally, I think something that shouldn't be overlooked, and is sometimes overlooked, is that classically in virtue ethics, particularly in Aristotle, this goal of cultivating character isn't, or doesn't have to be, a solitary goal. Right? It's not something that you do all on your own, but friends, perhaps friends with shared values, or similar values, or slightly different values, can help in critical discussion. This isn't Van Gogh's own painting of how the sunflowers look to Van Gogh. It's Gauguin's. That's it.
Questions?
Yes, John, I don't understand the problem about it. So I wonder if you could say more about it. When you say, I'm just looking at what you say in section 3 here, the aim of shaping your own character seems to involve the idea that action flows directly from character, not from deliberation. I'm not sure that that's a contrast that best known virtue theorists, people like Foote or Housecroft would really understand, and that if I understand people like Foote and Housecroft, their thought is that having a certain virtuous character trait just is to deliberate in a certain way. What makes it just is that he thinks about his practical reasoning has a certain character. He assigns certain considerations weight that an unjust man would not assign weight to. Those considerations aren't themselves arete considerations. Thoughts about character don't feature on the premises of his practical reason. If I'm generous, then my practical reason perhaps is premises things like, John's in trouble, he needs my help. I don't think he can afford to pay for his lunch, and thoughts like that. No, this would be generous. That's only going to feature in the margin. So there's not really a contrast between these two things. Reflection on one's character will be there in a virtuous person, but not, as it were, not in the form of, I think a detour is the wrong way to put it. Suppose you have a profession where, in order to do that profession well, you need to be physically strong. You're a construction worker, or a removal man, or a soldier. Suppose too that you have no intrinsic interest in being physically strong, and you have no narcissistic interest, and you don't want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, so you can admire yourself in the mirror, but you want to be good at your job, because you want to be able to get this piano up the stairs without breaking it, and you want to be able to rescue these hostages without killing any good guys, or whatever. And in order to do that, you've got to be physically strong. Thoughts about how physically strong you are aren't going to feature in your everyday deliberation about how do I get this piano up the stairs. But still, you know, you've got to go to the gym, because you're going to have the second order deliberation is going to take that. In order to do this well, I have to be like this, and in order to be like this, I have to work at that. So what's the problem?
Okay. So two thoughts then. I mean, one is, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right that I agree that virtue theory classically doesn't require you to, as you put it, have arete thoughts in the premises of practical reason, and that the worry occurs at the reflective level. I guess the in a way the removal man case in a way kind of illustrates what I mean when I talk about double-think. So, whether or not you're capable of lifting the piano up the stairs effectively isn't a question of whether you want to, right? Entirely. It's not a question of decisions you make, the considerations you take. I mean, obviously, there are going to be better and worse ways of doing it, but in terms of brute strength, it's just a question of whether your body is capable of doing that. And that's why you go to the gym, to make your body capable of doing that. The worry about doublethink is that there's a concern that you are thinking of your character in a similar way to the way in which you think about the strength of your muscles. They just are going to lift this or they're not when I try. But because you're talking about character, it's the trying itself. So although, I agree with Foot and Hursthouse and Annas and others that having the virtues is just practical reasoning in a certain way. But that still leaves the question of how one is supposed to aim at bringing that about, and how one thinks about it. So you might think that some virtue theories that work that way are, as it were, kind of self-effacing. Is that you don't aim at the virtues at all. You just aim at reasoning in the right way and taking the right considerations into.
I don't. You're partly explaining the problem, but I don't think in terms of your analogy with the prediction decision problem, and I'm not sure that I'm happy with that analogy. It's certainly true that if you're a good, strong, removal man, when you're thinking about moving the piano up the stairs, you're just thinking about the practical problem of moving the piano up the stairs. You're not thinking about your own physical prowess. When you reflect in moments of leisure as to whether you're up to this, then that's something else. And of course, you might, you just hurt your back. There's no point in even trying. There's no point in turning up to work because you're not up to this. Or there might be ways. Knowledge of your capacities might impact on your practical deliberation in some circumstances in other ways. And I remember when I was young, I used to go rock climbing, and there are certain moves and certain rock climbs that require you that are very, very strenuous, and you have to have really sort of forearms like tree trunks to do them. There are other moves in rock climbs that look like they're like that, but if you're cunning and devious, like me, you have no arm strength, you can find a clever trick that will get you up them without needing to have strong arms. So your reflection on, I can do it this way and I can't do it this way, will then impact on your deliberation about how to do it. Yes. But that's not the normal case.
No, but that's still first order deliberation. That's still at the level of how to climb the rock or whatever it is that you're doing, right? It's not about taking your own climbing ability to be as an object of reflection and trying to work on strategies for improving that. That's the thought.
Another question up here?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering if your solution escaped the charge of narcissism, because now when you're reflecting, you're just reflecting on how things seem to you.
Right.
What appears to you, what reason shows. So you're really just focused on you. And is that not the problem of the first?
Yeah. Okay. So that. Yeah. But it seems to me that that's maybe almost a kind of grammatical use of the word to you. Right? What you're focused on is how the situation seems, right? How it strikes you. But it's not yourself. Isn't the focus of your action. I guess the challenge of narcissism can't be that you shouldn't think of, about yourself at all, even in any position in the reflection, because otherwise you're not a moral agent. You're not worried about doing the right thing, right, or being the right kind of person. It's just that one's primary goal, one's focus and attention should be on situation. What did need to be done there? What was the right thing to do there? Should I have offered to pay for her dinner or not? That seems to me, that's what I want to get at. And so yeah, there is the really should I have.
Got a question down here?
Well, something of a follow-up, because that point, I think there's an interesting thing that you're drawing out in the way that the world reflects your character and moral commitments. And earlier you had mentioned Sartre as seeming to pose a problem in making that move because the world is just a projection. But one of the places where Sartre does talk about your experience of the world reflecting you is in the emotions, in the sketch of the emotions, where you experience the fact that you're happy in terms of a different way that the world looks when you're happy. But there, he says that, I mean, essentially, he thinks emotions are bad faith because they're giving up on your freedom to really assign value to the world. And what I want to note there is the way in which, for Sartre, the relation to the world, like what's really, he's sort of refusing a passivity where the world would shape me. And I think there, Merleau-Ponty is a little bit more interesting because there's much more of a reciprocity between how the world looks to me as reflecting my commitments, but also as reflecting a way that the world bogs me down in a certain way. So there's a sort of, in seeing my commitments manifest in the world, there's also seeing a way in which the world constricts me or obliges me in certain ways. And the racism example might be instructive here, that you might notice that you're a racist in the way that things look to you. But you also might notice that for them to look different to me, I'm going to need to change my world and the sorts of things that others say about my world and the way they position things and so on and so forth. And that, I mean, that really starts getting you out of a kind of narcissism, because you realize, you know, to have a character is to have the world appear to you in a certain way. Right? I don't really have the character of being the virtue hero if I'm seeing the world this way. But for it to change, then there's something more complicated and intersubjective that needs to be going on here. So, I mean, sort of picking up on the last point, but I think trying to push a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, on the second point first, I mean, so yeah, I put implicit racism as an example, I think, in the handout under section 6, and then I forgot to talk about it. Yeah, I think that's a really good example, in the thought that sometimes your own reactions might be at odds with the values that you would like them to embody. Sometimes, I mean, I said that you know, ethical practice involves a certain kind of phenomenology. Of course, this is a sense of the word phenomenology to mean a kind of study of the way in which the world seems to you. And that study could involve naturalistic psychology too, right? So you could find out about your implicit biases by doing a bunch of the implicit measures tests that psychologists run. And you could find out about the best way to counteract them by asking psychologists what they think are the best way to counteract them, right? So it's not just the thought that you can kind of heroically just take a good look at yourself and pull yourself together. It may be that you need the help of... It's a good example of needing cooperation from the world. You need the help of other people.
We all going to die.
Thank you. On the Sartre, I mean, so the sketch of theory and emotions is an earlier work, and I think that account of emotion, by the time you get to being and nothingness and the stuff in the circuit of selfness, but also later on in the existential psychoanalysis section in particular, is kind of transmuted into a more general kind of theory of affectivity, but also of constitution of the world. There's a curious thing about that, which is that although for most of his own theory of emotions, he seems to be presenting this view pretty much as you presented it. It's close to a form of bad faith. The world gets too difficult, so you just kind of get upset with it and transform it into a magical world. Or positive emotions too, right? You jump for joy and so on. You should behave in these magical ways rather than engaging in a kind of properly instrumental way. But right at the end, he gives this example of horror at seeing a face suddenly pop up at the window. And it looks like there, what he's giving is an account of of you responding genuinely to the world. The world kind of imposes this horrifying face suddenly out the window, and you jump, right? Nothing got too difficult for you, and so on. And it's a curious switch which people are discussing at the moment. And why does he suddenly seem to reverse his theory? Is he sort of vacillating between two theories? Has he got an overarching theory of two different kinds of emotional experience? That's the debate that's going on at the moment. I think it's really a curious way that he structures his early books. So a similarly curious thing happens at the end of The Imaginary, right? So for the whole book, he's gone on and on about how perception and imagination are two irreducible attitudes, right? And then in the conclusion, you know, and you can never mix the two. Even what appears to be hallucination mixed with perception is actually just a partially veridical hallucination. All this stuff always be working in line at the end. It turns out that imagination is an essential constituent in perception, which seems like a completely different theory, and it's not clear where it's come from. And I think what he's doing, this is kind of sketchy, is that he's kind of warming you up. Those last claims are kind of claims about the transcendental constitution of the world, and he's kind of warming you up for them with talk about kind of empirical consciousness and empirical emotion or empirical imagination, and then having kind of got clear on what these things constitutively are at the empirical level, he then wants to say, and they operate at the transcendental level, thank you and good night, at the end of the book. And then it's being a nothingness where that thought really gets going. Does that sort of help?
Well, I think we have to stop there. Thanks very much for a very interesting paper.